HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Black Lizard Big Book of Pulps. The best crime stories from the pulps during their golden age, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. By Otto Penzler. Read by Daniel Thomas May, Eric Jason Martin, and Traci Odom. Foreword by Otto Penzler. Like jazz, the hard-boiled private detective is entirely an American invention, and it was given life in the pages of pulp magazines. Pulp now is a nearly generic term, frequently misused to indicate hack work of inferior literary achievement. While that often may be accurate, pulp was not intended to describe literary excellence or lack thereof, but was derived from the word pulpwood, which is the very cheap paper that was used to produce popular magazines. These, in turn, were the offspring of dime novels, mainly magazine-sized mystery, western, and adventure novels produced for young or unsophisticated readers. After World War I, the popularity of American pulpwood magazines increased rapidly, reaching their peak of success in the 1920s and 1930s, as more than 500 titles a month hit the newsstands. With their reasonable prices, mostly a dime or 15 cents a copy, brilliantly colored covers depicting lurid and thrilling scenes, and a writing style that emphasized action and adventure above philosophizing and introspection, millions of copies of this new, uniquely American literature were sold every week. At first, the magazines sought to publish something for all tastes, so a single issue might feature a Western story, an aviation adventure, a mystery, a science fiction tale, and a sports report. New titles came along, and most of the old ones quickly morphed into special interest publications. The very first issues of Black Mask, for example, often had Western scenes on the covers, but by the mid-1920s it had become devoted almost entirely to mystery fiction. While there were magazines designated to stories of railroads, jungle adventure, spicy stories, romance, horror, and any other subject that enterprising publishers thought would attract a readership, the most successful pulps were those featuring superheroes and detective fiction. With the notable exception of Weird Tales, the long-lived pulp devoted to fantasy and science fiction. One of the elements that made the detective magazines so popular was the heroic figures in the center of the action. The hard-boiled cop, or especially private detective, was the idealization of the lone individual representing justice and decency pitted against virulent gangs, corrupt politicians, or other agencies who violated that sense of goodness with which most readers identified. The best of these crime-fighting tough guys became series characters, taking on one group of thugs after another, always emerging victorious in spite of the almost hopeless odds he, and these protagonists were almost always male, encountered. Many of the most memorable of these protagonists became staples of Black Mask, Detective Fiction Weekly, Dime Detective, and other major pulp publications. Dashiell Hammett's Continental Op, Carol John Daly's Race Williams, Frank Gruber's Oliver Quaid, Ramon de Colta's Raoul Whitfield, Joe Garr, Norbert Davis's Max Latin, George Harmon Cox's Flash Casey, W.T. Ballard's Bill Lennox, Robert Reeves's Cellini Smith, and Frederick L. Nebel's Cardigan are just a few of the detectives who appeared month after month to the delight of a reading public whose appetite for this sort of no-nonsense, shoot-first-and-ask-questions-later fiction remained unsated until the end of the Second World War. Crime fighters in the pulps were seldom the sensitive type who understood that a difficult childhood or an unloving grandmother were responsible for the violence of the criminals with whom they came into contact. No, his role was to battle bad guys, and he did it without fear, without pity, and without remorse. It was a black-and-white world in the pulps, a simple conflict between the forces of goodness and virtue and those who sought to plunder, harm, and kill the innocent. In the pages of the pulps, and between the covers of this book, good is triumphant over evil. Perhaps that is the key to the enormous popularity they enjoyed for so many years. Depression-era crowds eagerly snatched up each new episode of their favorite crime-fighting protagonist, rooting for and identifying with the stalwart men of action and intellect. In addition to the hero, there was another essential element in each adventure: a monstrous opponent. For a hero to be worthy of the name, it was utterly required that he do battle with a villain so despicable, so vile, so conscienceless, that only a man of supreme strength of body and mind and an incorruptible soul could hope to emerge victorious. Here, in the crimes of Richmond City, you will see the almost overwhelming odds faced by McBride and Kennedy as they attempt to right the wrongs they are forced to encounter. Other detectives in other tales had no lesser difficulties to overcome. The Pulps were also home to a different kind of crook, and readers were able to identify with them, too. These larcenous entities were admittedly thieves, but not your common or garden-variety robber. Virtually all the thieves who became successful series characters in the Pulps, and indeed in all of crime fiction, were Robin Hood-type crooks. They did not commit violent acts, and they stole from the rich. Not just any rich person, mind you, but always someone who had come by his fortune illicitly. This was an exceptionally agreeable manner of behaving during the Depression era, when literally millions of Americans were jobless, standing in slow-moving bread lines to procure minimal sustenance for themselves and their families. The impoverished multitudes blamed the actions of Wall Street brokers, bankers, big businessmen, and factory owners for their plight. So what could be more attractive than to see someone break into their posh apartments and crack their safes, or nick the diamond necklaces from the fat necks of their bloated wives? Furthermore, these crooks generally donated their swag to charity or to a worthy individual, after deducting a sufficient amount to ensure their own rather lavish lifestyle, of course. Perhaps not strangely, but nevertheless in apparent contradiction to their chosen careers, a large percentage of these redistributionist thieves, after several successful adventures, become detectives. Often they are suspected of a murder or another crime which they did not commit, and so must discover the true culprit in order to exonerate themselves. In other instances, they have friends in the police department who need their help. A long tradition of criminals behaving in this manner predates the pulp era. The American master criminal, Frederick Irving Anderson's creation, the infallible Godall, not included in this collection because he did not appear in the pulps, was so brilliant that he planned and executed capers so meticulously that he was never arrested. Eventually, the police paid him a large stipend to not commit crimes, since they knew they could never catch him and wanted to avoid the embarrassment of seeing headlines with yet another successful burglary. It is left to your own ethical proclivities to determine whether you identify with the safecrackers, con men, burglars, and villains, or with the police who are paid to catch them. Women were not significant in the early years of the pulp magazines. Hulbert Footner's Rossica Story was a successful character in the pages of Argosy, eventually appearing as the prime figure in 6 books beginning in the late 1920s, but she had little company. Black Mask seldom used stories in which women were featured, rarely bought stories by women writers, and never had a female series character. The major authors didn't mind writing about women. They merely wrote about them, sometimes with great prominence, as the catalyst for all the ensuing action. Also, in more cases than not, they were the victims, either innocents or bad girls who got what was coming to them, according to the murderer. When girls, and they were usually called girls or dolls or, heaven help us, frails, or some term of endearment like honey or sugar or baby or cutie, took the role of detective, they tended to be acceptable to male readers mainly when they were assistants, girlfriends, or professional sidekicks, such as reporters. Their roles were predictable in most stories. If they weren't present as comic relief, they needed to be rescued. It would be impossible to calculate the number of pretty young things who were kidnapped or held hostage until our hero burst through a door on the last page to save her, often from a fate worse than death. One needs only to look at the colorful cover paintings that adorned the magazines for evidence of this cliché. It is a rare cover indeed that does not display a buxom beauty in a low-cut dress or sweater, frequently in tatters, being menaced by a thug or gang of thugs. Some of the lesser pulps, those that paid even less than the standard penny a word, began to feature women in the second decade of the detective pulps, the 1930s, while those that sought an audience with racier material such as gun mauls, saucy stories, and spicy detective had even more ample reason to feature them. In these pages, opportunities for placing luscious young beauties in grave peril of violation were rampant, providing titillation to young male readers who hid their 10-cent purchases inside newspapers or more respectable journals. One role in crime fiction in which women have been featured with some regularity is as the criminals. The pages of the pulps are rich with female jewel thieves of a certain elegance, who always seem to be in formal attire at a country house party or a penthouse soiree. They function largely in the same manner as their male counterparts, though they are often required to use their seductive beauty to escape capture. Tough broads appeared in later pulps, either as out-and-out hoodlums or, more frequently but no less dangerously, as gun mauls for their gangster boyfriends. All types of female detectives and crooks who first saw the light of day in pulp magazines appear in Section 3 of this book. There are independent private investigators, assistants, rogues, victims, mauls, police officers, and innocent bystanders. They are young and old, good-looking and plain, funny and dour, brave and timid, violent and gentle, honest and crooked. In short, very much like their male counterparts. While there is more than one way to judge the success of a pulp magazine, including longevity, circulation, and profitability, the undisputed champion in the area of having developed the greatest writers and having had the most long-lasting literary influence was Black Mask, and most of the stories in this collection were originally published in its pages. Had it done no more than publish Carroll John Daly's first story, Black Mask would have achieved immortality. On May 15, 1923, with the publication of Three Gun Terry, the hard-boiled private eye made his first appearance, quickly followed by Daly's creation of Race Williams, the first series character in hard-boiled fiction. While Daly was truly a hack writer devoid of literary pretension, aspiration, and ability, he laid the foundation for the form that continues to flourish to this day in the work of such writers as Robert B. Parker, Joe Gores, James Crumley, Bill Pronzini, Michael Connolly, and James Lee Burke. Although the latter two employ series characters who are cops, they function in the same individualistic way that private investigators do, and frequently use the same smart-aleck speech patterns as their kindred freelancers do. Dashiell Hammett produced the first Continental Op story for Black Mask later in the same year, and the future of the genre was secure, as the editors and the reading public quickly recognized that this was serious literature in the guise of popular fiction. Every significant writer of the pulp era worked for Black Mask, including Paul Kane, Horace McCoy, Frederick L. Niebel, Raoul Whitfield, Earl Stanley Gardner, Charles G. Booth, Roger Torrey, Norbert Davis, George Harmon Cox, and, of course, the greatest of them all, Raymond Chandler. It was the era between the two world wars in which the pulps flourished, their garish covers enticing readers and their cheap prices providing mass entertainment through the years of the Great Depression. It has been widely stated that the advent of television tolled the death knell for the pulps, but it is not true. They were replaced by the creation and widespread popularity of paperback books, virtually unknown as a mass-market commodity before World War II. There is quotable prose in these pages, and characters that you will remember, and fascinating evocations of another time and place. But the writers mainly had the goal of entertaining readers when these stories were produced. No reasonable reader will ever complain that the stories are slow-moving, that they lack action and conflict, in short, that they are dull. Many of the contributors to this book went on to successful writing careers in other arenas, including Hollywood. But here is the real stuff. Stories written at breakneck speed and designed to be read the same way. The Crime Fighters. Introduction by Harlan Coben. Dear reader, oh man, do I envy you. Welcome to the world of pulp fiction. If you have been here before, well, skip this introduction and dive in. You already have some idea of the delights that await. For the rest of you, I will keep this brief. I know some writers who claim that they have never read pulp fiction. I put them in two classes. The larger group I call, for lack of a better term, liars. Of course they have read pulp fiction. They may not know it. They may, because of the various connotations derived from the word pulp, not want to admit it. But come on now. Reading pulp fiction is a bit like, something else. 90% of the writers out there admit they do it. 10% lie about it. The second group, the writers who really have never read pulp fiction, yes, I know this contradicts the last paragraph where I basically said 100% read it, but go with me here. These are writers the rest of us do not associate with. They have poor self-esteem. They had a troubled home life. They are not fun at parties. Discovering pulp fiction now, right now, is a bit like finding a lost treasure. You are unearthing something that will entertain, enlighten, amuse, horrify, mangle, jangle, keep you riveted. Decades after they were written, these stories still manage to have an edge. Edge, that might be the key for me. These stories still cut, still tear, still even shock a bit. These guys experimented. They wrote on the move. They wrote, like Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde, for money. They went places maybe they shouldn't have, and we love them for it. I like edge. I like it a lot. I think you will too. Otto Penzler has carefully selected the greatest of the great from the history of pulp fiction. Legendary writers you've already heard of, like Dashiell Hammett, Earl Stanley Gardner, Cornell Woolrich, and Raymond Chandler are here. Legendary writers that you should have heard of, like Frederick L. Niebel, Paul Kane, Carol John Daly, George Harmon Cox, Charles Booth, Leslie White, William Rollins, Norbert Davis, Horace McCoy, and Thomas Walsh are also where they should be, with the greats. In short, you got the goods here. Finally, you have a great tour guide for this treasure hunt. Otto Penzler knows more about pulp fiction than pretty much anyone else I know. He also has self-esteem, a fine home life, and man, is he fun at parties. Okay, put a bullet in this. I'm done. Turn the page, damn it. Start reading. 1, 2, 3. Paul Kane. One of the true mystery men of pulp fiction, Paul Kane was discovered to be the pseudonym of the successful screenwriter Peter Rurik. Then, not so many years ago, it was further learned that even that name was a disguise for the author's actual name, George Carroll Sims, 1902 to 1966. His fame as a writer of crime fiction rests with a single novel, Fast One, 1933, which Raymond Chandler called some kind of high point in the ultra-hard-boiled manner. The novel had its genesis in a series of short stories published in Black Mask, beginning with Fast One in the March 1932 issue, followed by 4 other adventures of Jerry Kells and his alcoholic girlfriend, S. Granquist. Kane had been writing pulp stories in New York but moved to Los Angeles when Cary Grant began filming Gambling Ship, which was loosely based on these stories. The sale of the film to Hollywood inspired him to pull the stories together as a novel, which was both savaged by the review media at the time while praised by others. It sold few copies, and he never wrote another. He did write films, however, most famously The Black Cat, 1934, about a satanic cult that starred Boris Karloff, with whom he became friends, as well as Affairs of a Gentleman, 1934, Grand Central Murders, 1942, and Mademoiselle Fifi, 1944. 123 was first published in Black Mask in May 1933 and collected in his short story collection Seven Slayers, 1946. 123. Paul Kane. A private dick tries to cut into a big role. I'd been in Los Angeles waiting for this Healy to show for nearly a week. According to my steer, he'd taken a railroad company in Quebec for somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000 on a swarm of juggled options or something. That's a nice neighborhood. My information said further that he was headed west and that he dearly loved to play cards. I do too. I'll take 3 off the top, please. I missed him by about 2 hours in Chicago and spent the day going around to all the ticket officers getting chummy with agents. Finally found out Healy had bought a ticket to L.A., so I fanned on out there and cooled. Pass. Sunday afternoon I ran into an op for Eastern Investigators, Inc., named Guard, in the lobby of the Roosevelt. We had a couple drinks and talked about this and that. He was on the coast looking for a gent named Healy. He was cagey about who the client was, but Eastern handles mostly missing persons, divorces, stuff like that. Monday morning, Guard called me and said the Salt Lake branch of his outfit had located Healy in Caliente, Nevada. He said he thought I might like to know. I told him I wasn't interested and thanked him, and then I rented a car in a U-Drive place and drove up to Caliente. I got there about 4 in the afternoon and spotted Healy in the second joint I went into. He was sitting in a stud game with 5 of the homeboys, and if they were a fair sample of the local talent, I figured I had plenty of time. Healy was a big man with a round, cheery face, smooth pink skin. His mouth was loose and wet, and his eyes were light blue. I think his eyes were the smallest I've ever seen. They were set very wide apart. He won and lost pretty evenly, but the game wasn't worth a nickel. The homeboys were old-timers and played close to their vests, and Healy's luck was the only thing that kept him even. He finally scared 2 of them out of a $70 or $80 pot, and that made him feel so good that he got up and came over to the bar and ordered drinks for the boys at the table. He ordered lemonade for himself. I said, "Excuse me, but haven't I seen you around Lonnie Thompson's in Detroit?" Lonnie makes a book, and I had most of my dope on Healy from him. He smiled and said, "Maybe," and asked me what I drank. I ordered whiskey. He asked me if I'd been in town long, and I said I'd just driven up from L.A. to look things over, and that things didn't look so hot, and that I would probably drive back to L.A. that night or the next morning. I bought him another lemonade and had another whiskey, and we talked about Detroit. In a little while he went back to the table and sat down. That was enough for a beginning. I had registered myself with him as one of the boys. I went out and drove a couple of blocks to the Pine Hotel and took a room. The Pine was practically the only hotel in town, but I flipped the register back a day or so and found Healy's name to make sure. Then I went up and washed and lay down to smoke a cigarette and figure out the details. According to Lonnie Thompson, Healy was a cash boy, carried his dough in paper and traveler's checks. I couldn't be sure of that, but it was enough. The point was to get him to L.A. and into 1 or 2 or 3 places where I could work on him. I guess I must have slept almost an hour because it was dark when I woke up. Somebody was knocking at the door, and I got up and stumbled over and switched on the light and opened the door. I was too sleepy to take Healy big. I mumbled something about coming in and sitting down, and went over to the basin and put some cold water on my face. When I turned around, he was sitting on the bed looking scared. I offered him a cigarette, and he took it, and his hand was shaking. He said, "Sorry I woke you up like that." I said, "That's all right." And then he leaned forward and spoke in a very low voice. "I've got to get out of here right away. I want to know how much it's worth to you to take me down to Los Angeles." I almost fell off the chair. My first impulse was to yell, "Sure," and drag him down to the car. But he was scared of something, and when a man's scared is a swell time to find out what it's all about. I stalled. I said, "Oh, that's all right," sort of hesitantly. He said, "Listen, I got here Saturday morning. I was going to stay here long enough to establish residence and then apply for one of those quick divorces under the Nevada law. My wife has been on my tail 6 weeks with a blackmail gag," he went on. "She's here. When I got back to the hotel a little while ago, she came into my room and put on an act." I thought then I knew who Guard's client was. "She came in this afternoon. She's got the room next to mine." He was silent so long that I laughed a little and said, "So what?" "I've got to duck quick," he went on. "She's a bad actor. She came into my room and put on an act. She's got a guy with her that's supposed to be her brother, and he's a bad actor, too. You said you were going to drive back to L.A. I saw your name on the register when I came in, and I thought you might take me along. I can't rent a car here, and there isn't a train till midnight." He pulled the biggest roll I ever saw out of his pocket and skimmed off a couple notes. "If it's a question of money—" I shook my head with what I hoped was a suggestion of dignity. I said, "I'd decided to go back myself tonight. It will be a pleasure to take you, Mr. Healy." And I got up and put on my coat. "How about your stuff?" He looked blank until I said, "Luggage." And then he said, "That's all right. I'll leave it." He smiled again. "I travel light." At the top of the stairs, he whispered, "This is sure a big lift." Then he remembered that he had to sneak up to his room to get something, and said he'd meet me at the car. I told him where it was. He said he'd paid his hotel bill. I went on downstairs and checked out. My car was wedged in between a Ford truck and a light blue Chrysler Roadster. There was plenty of room ahead of the Roadster, so I went up and snapped off the handbrake and pushed it ahead about 8 feet. Then I got into my car and leaned back and waited. The whole layout looked pretty bad, what with him scared to death of a deal he admitted was blackmail and all. He said he didn't want his luggage, and then right on top of it, he had to go up to his room to get something. That would be taking a chance on running into the wife again. I wondered if she was his wife. I couldn't figure out how a wife could blackmail a husband while she was jumping from state to state with a man who was supposed to be her brother. But then, almost anything is possible in Nevada. After about 5 minutes, I began to get nervous. I opened the door of the car and stepped out on the sidewalk, and as I closed the door, there were 5 shots close together someplace upstairs in the hotel. I can take trouble or leave it alone, only I always take it. Like a sap, I went into the hotel. The clerk was a big blonde kid with glasses. He came out from behind the counter as I went in the door. We went upstairs together, 2 or 3 at a time. There was a man in long, woolly underwear standing in the corridor on the 3rd floor, and he pointed to a door, and we went in. Healy was lying flat on his face in the middle of the room, and beyond him, close to the wall, was the body of a woman, also face downward. The clerk turned a beautiful shade of green. He stood there staring at Healy. I went over and rolled the woman over on her back. She couldn't have been much over 22 or 3, little gray-eyed blonde. There was a knife in her side under the arm. There was a .38 automatic near her outstretched hand. She was very dead. The man in the woolly underwear peeked in and then hurried across the hall and into another room. I could hear him yelling the news to somebody there. I went over and tapped the clerk on the shoulder and pointed at the girl. The clerk swallowed a couple of times, said, "Miss McKay," and looked back at Healy. He was hypnotized by the way Healy's back looked. Hamburger. Then about 24 people came into the room all at once. The sheriff had been in a pool hall across the street. He rolled Healy over and said, "This is Mr. Healy," as if he'd made a great discovery. I said, "Uh-huh. He's been shot." I guess the sheriff didn't like the way I said it very well. He glanced at the clerk and then asked me who I was. I told him my name, and the clerk nodded, and the sheriff scratched his head and went over and looked at the girl. I wanted to say that she'd been knifed, but I restrained myself. Shaggy Underwear was back with his pants on. He said he hadn't heard anything except somebody swearing, and then, suddenly, The shots. I asked him how long after the shots it had been when he came into the corridor, and he said he wasn't sure, but it was somewhere around half a minute. The first interesting thing that turned up was that it wasn't Healy's room. It was Miss McKay's room. His was...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?